The Obama administration has early on adopted this policy and now needs to follow through on achieving its final acceptance by the Senate, as Ambassador Gardner has said. Adlai Stevenson knew in a nuclear age that peace was a condition of human survival, and if ignored, nuclear proliferation could sooner or later get out of hand. He therefore believed that the UN needed an increased capacity to timely act in troubled areas throughout the world. Assistant Secretary of State Harlan Cleveland, former UN Ambassador Charles Yost, and William Van Heuvel, and Undersecretary General Brian Urquhart, who's here with us tonight, or this afternoon, have all spoken of this, respecting the need for creation under the UN Charter of ongoing limited military strike forces from member nations available for immediate deployment by the Security Council to combat and stabilize distress in human loss in the Congo, Lebanon, and elsewhere, such as Darfur, and now perhaps in the Middle East. Stevenson then thus closed his remarks at Northwestern Law School, where I also attended, some 9 months before his untimely passing, with this appeal, quotes, "We can't choose to help or not to help. We can't patronize. We can't coerce, and we can't drop out. We are all in it together, we the human race, and we either learn, all of us, to do a better job of running this planet Earth, or we shall all perish together. For," he said, "in a nuclear age, there is nowhere else to go, at least not yet." Close quotes. Harlan Cleveland, your associate and my treasured friend, was right. American foreign policy still recognizes the wisdom, he said, of Adlai Stevenson's thinking and his patented rhetoric, that America's role in its own interests and in the wider interests of humanity lies in the patient and spectacular, and if need be, lonely search for the interests which unite nations for the international instruments of law and security. Surely, the world will continue to benefit from the inspiration of his words and actions that deeply affect us all.
Thank you very much, Judge Liebling. And now it's my special pleasure to introduce Adlai E. Stevenson III, the oldest son of Governor Stevenson, a former U.S. Senator from Illinois. He's now board chairman of SC&M Investment Management Company, an investment banking firm in Chicago. After graduated from Harvard College, he served as a Marine Corps tank platoon commander in Korea. He also graduated from Harvard Law School, then in 1957. And in 1958, he joined the Chicago-based law firm of Meyer, Brown, and Platt, becoming a partner in 1966. With record-breaking margins, he was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives in 1965 to 67, as Illinois State Treasurer in 1967 to 1970, and as the United States Senator from Illinois from 1970 to 1981. Senator, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. My father is a very worthy successor at the United Nations. At the United Nations, he said he preferred to be addressed as governor, because if he was addressed as ambassador, 100 heads would turn. His roots ran deep in central Illinois to a great-grandfather who was Abraham Lincoln's political sponsor and patron. Lincoln was an inspiration. But he was also a product of Princeton, of World War I, and Woodrow Wilson's internationalism. From boyhood, he was a peripatetic student of the world on the ground, exploring its monuments and ruins, its markets and favelas. I recall him once saying that he wished he could find a mountain to climb that his devoted friend and supporter Eleanor Roosevelt hadn't climbed first. As a student in Europe and a young correspondent in Russia, he had seen the ravages of war. He saw World War II in the Pacific and the Italian peninsula and the aftermath of war. from the Navy and State Departments. The egghead, everybody old enough to remember that he was known as the egghead because he was an intellectual and he had a Websterian, we call it a Websterian brow. But the egghead was a realist, a hard-boiled egghead, a realistic realist. His perspective from no ivory tower of armchair strategists and publicists. He was an architect of the UN at San Francisco in 1945. We lived in war-torn London later that year, where he represented the United States on the Preparatory Commission for the UN. Great men gathered excitedly at our little home in the evenings. We had access to the U.S. commissary. I can still remember seeing eggs with "Made in Canada" stamped on them. London was hungry, so great men gathered at our little home in the evenings to discuss plans for a world order based on law, cooperation, diplomacy, and development assistance that would finally end war for all time. Lester Pearson was there, Jan Masaryk, Gladwin Jebb, Henri Spaak were there, and Andrei Gromyko, a young Sir Brian Urquhart was there. Many years later, after he had served as Deputy Secretary General, I heard Sir Brian say that Adlai was such a great diplomat, he could even make Andrei Gromyko laugh. In Foreign Secretary Gromyko's Kremlin lair many years later, I failed that test, protesting the Soviet Union's militarization of outer space. Now it and China protest. In his campaigns for president and as titular leader of the Democratic Party, the governor laid the programmatic foundation for the new frontier and great society. He supported the UN, efforts to close the gap between the haves and have-nots in the world, and began the strategic arms limitations process with his proposal for cessation of nuclear testing in the atmosphere. Ambassador Gardner has mentioned many achievements of the years which followed at the UN, but they were hard years. I think they shortened his life. He groaned once that diplomacy consisted of equal parts of protocol, alcohol, and geritol. He took the social, the representational obligations of host ambassador seriously, but that was the least of it. He couldn't get a hearing in the White House for Secretary General U Thant's proposal for a diplomatic resolution of the conflict in Southeast Asia. He's remembered, and has been this evening, for his presentation to the Security Council during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he was vilified in public for proposing a diplomatic alternative to confrontation, trading obsolete U.S. bases in Turkey for Soviet withdrawal from Cuba. That's the deal the Kennedy administration struck, but insisted on its secrecy. So Khrushchev was humiliated and succeeded by a cabal from which Brezhnev, the hardliner, emerged and Cold War escalated. It's easier to wage war than to make peace, as Premier Clemenceau said at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. And the Gov was a peacemaker. He was planning to quietly resign at the end of 1965 because he did not support policies in Southeast Asia he was forced to advocate. But he died first, just a few blocks from our little home in London, 20 years earlier, still serving the United Nations. He saw the world from within the world. He could see his country from outside it. He didn't lecture other countries. Their leaders sought him out and listened. He was welcomed before it was over, the world over, as the voice of the world from within America. So much so that Secretary Dulles, during the Eisenhower administration, insisted on making him a roving ambassador during these world travels, which never ceased. In a dynamic, interconnected nuclear world, the efficiencies of asymmetrical warfare mount along with the inefficiencies of conventional warfare. His fragile spaceship Earth, its reserves of air, water, and soil are more vulnerable. And the United Nations and its family of agencies become more vital and more stretched and beleaguered. America's politics today bears very little resemblance to the politics my family experienced over 5 generations. I've attempted to record it and its lessons from the past in the Black Book. That's named for a family political archive, which begins with Lincoln in Illinois and ends in modern China. It's easier to wage war than make peace, but the Gov, I think today, would be hopeful. In the life cycle of nations, China and other countries rise and become a larger part of the multilateralism once led by the United States. And Illinois has produced a president who reflects something of a worldview and a renewed commitment to multilateralism, the United Nations, to diplomacy as an alternative to war.
Thank you, Senator, very, very much. It's now my very special pleasure to introduce someone that is so well known here in New York that all introductions are superfluous. A man whose entire working life has spanned the life of this organization and who has been intimately involved in it from the beginning. Someone who served finally as Undersecretary General of the United Nations. Sir Brian Urquhart, during the war, served as an intelligence officer. Many will know that he, particular, warned the planning staffs of the dangers of Market Garden, the airborne operation that you will all remember in the movie A Bridge Too Far. He turned out to be prescient and correct in his warnings. It is typical of Sir Brian Urquhart. He was a member of the staff involved in setting up the United Nations in 1945 and has worked for or advised every Secretary General of the United Nations since its inception. His main fields of interest and operation in the United Nations have been conflict resolution and peacekeeping. He helped to organize the first peacekeeping force in Egypt after the Suez Crisis. In every conceivable way, Sir Brian is both Mr. United Nations in this town, if anybody is, and he is certainly respected and honored as the father of UN peacekeeping. His main functions as Undersecretary General, as I just noted, were direction of the peacekeeping forces, then predominantly in the Middle East and Cyprus, and negotiations in these 2 areas. Amongst others, his contributions also included work on the negotiations relating to a Namibia peace settlement, negotiations in Kashmir, in Lebanon, and work on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Brian, it is a delight, a pleasure, and an honor to have you here, and I turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. I think that the first thing to say about Adlai Stevenson in relation to the United Nations was that he was very genuinely one of the founders of this organization. And it wasn't just that he believed in it and expressed in magical language the aspirations which so many of us had at the end of the Second World War, but he actually did something about it. In fact, at the San Francisco conference, which opened in the spring of 1945,